Hi, I'm Alex from Ornament Designs, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to make this picture window Kimekomi ornament. If you're new to Kimekomi, which is also known as the tucked fabric technique, I encourage you to go to my website where you can find everything you need to get started, including a list of tools and materials you'll need, as well as a free beginner's tutorial which you can download after signing up for my email list. All right, this is going to be a basic picture window ornament. It's a beginner's level design. If you've already gotten comfortable making a basic striped and reflections design, then this would be the next logical step. First, you'll start by drawing a dot, marking the north pole of your ball, and then turn it over and mark the south pole. My ball has factory markings to help me find those points. If yours does not, then I have another video, which I will link in the description, that will show you how to find the poles and equator on your ball. Now I need to make 8 equally distant marks on the equator line. For this ornament, I'm using a 10 centimeter diameter ball. I need to find the circumference of my ball first. I'll multiply the diameter of my ball by pi, which is 3.14. So the circumference of my ball is 31.4 centimeters. Then I'll divide the circumference by 4 and then again by 8. So first I'll measure 4 equidistant points on the equator, and then I'm going to go back and measure the next 4 points in between for a total of 8 evenly distributed points around the equator. And the reason why I'm doing this is that it seems to prevent measuring mistakes. Sometimes, if I'm doing it just with an 8 division measurement, if I'm off by even 1 millimeter in my markings at the beginning, by the time I get to the last mark, it can be off by several millimeters. So doing it by 4 and then by 8 seems to prevent that from happening. I like doing the math because my foam balls are so well made, but there's another method for making these points called the paper strip method, and I'll link that video in the description. You may want to try that method if for whatever reason the math just isn't working for you. All right, so I'm going to speed up the video here because otherwise this video is going to be more than an hour long. So in order to save on time, I'm going to speed up the video here and throughout the video. Okay, so I've finished my first 4 points, and now I'm going back in and I'm filling in the last 4 points for a total of 8 points around the equator of the ball. By the way, at the beginning of the video, I mentioned I would have a list of tools and materials on my website, but I'm also going to be linking some tools and materials in the description and also going to be tagging some products throughout the video. And these may not be the exact products that you see that I'm using here, but they're going to be something comparable. Okay, so now using my tape measure as a straight edge, I'm going to draw a vertical line connecting the North Pole, an equator point, and the South Pole. Then I'm going to turn the ball around and continue that line on the other side until I have a vertical line going all the way around the ball. Next, I'll draw another vertical line perpendicular to that one I just drew. And I'll draw another straight line going all the way around the ball until my ball is divided into 4 equal sections. Now I'm going to draw some halfway points, also known as midpoints. This is a point that is halfway between the North Pole and the equator. It should be the same measurement as your 8 division measurement. And I'll place these points within those 4 sections on both the north half and the south half of the ball. So in total, there will be 8 midpoints drawn. In other words, you're measuring from the pole to an equator point that is between the 2 vertical lines. Okay, so once you have all of your midpoints drawn, then what you're going to do is connect those midpoints to each other across the poles. So here I'm connecting a midpoint to another midpoint across the north pole of the ball. And you will do that for all of your midpoints. So you're drawing an X across the North Pole. Once you finish with the North Pole, you'll turn the ball over and you'll do the same thing on the South Pole. Next, you're going to connect the midpoints again across the equator and crossing the vertical line. So your tape measure will start at a North Pole midpoint, cross through the vertical line at the equator to an adjacent South Pole midpoint. And then again, you'll do the same thing, creating an X across the vertical line, connecting a north midpoint to a south midpoint. And you'll do that for all of your midpoints, crossing all of your vertical lines. So you'll have 4 X's on each side of your ball. And this will create 4 diamond-shaped picture windows on each of the 4 sides of the ball. Now, this is not the only way to draw this. Some people prefer a different pattern of drawing the lines for this design, but for me, this is the most efficient way of doing it, and I always have consistent results. Next, using your craft knife, you're going to cut about 1 centimeter deep along all of the lines that you've drawn. You will get a smoother cutting experience if you have a fresh, sharp blade, which is why I like these slider type knives, because when the blade gets dull, I can just snap off the end for a new sharp edge. And once you've finished cutting all of your lines, you'll take your tucking tool and run it through the cuts to widen the grooves and to make sure that everything has actually been cut. Now I'm going to show you how to make a cutting template using a standard piece of tracing paper. What you're going to do is you're going to place the tracing paper over the top of that picture window section. And then you'll get a pen or whatever you happen to have on hand, pencil is fine too, and just roughly trace that shape onto the tracing paper. Now, as you can see here, the tracing paper doesn't really lay flat. It's sort of, it kind of folds because, of course, you've got a piece of paper which is like two-dimensional and a piece and a round sphere which is three-dimensional, so it doesn't quite work perfectly, but it's sufficient enough. And once you get used to doing it this way, you'll figure it out. You could also use vinyl if you have some clear vinyl, or any other kind of clear, like transparent type material that would hold its shape and not get stretched out or deformed in any way as you use it. And if you need to, you can pin the center so that it will stay in place. The tracing paper is not ideal, but it is the least expensive solution. Cut out the shape that you drew on the paper. Then you'll want to place the shape back over the picture window section just to make sure that it's not totally off and that it's basically the correct shape. It will not be perfect. A rough estimate is just fine. And because it's not a perfect shape, I'm just going to draw a little arrow on mine so I know which is the correct orientation. And now you can use it to see how the motif on your fabric is going to fit within the picture window on your ornament. And you can use the paper to also cut out the fabric. So here I'm giving myself about 1 centimeter's allowance around the paper and around the motif, because that is where the fabric is going to tuck into the grooves. Then you'll cut out your fabric along the line that you just drew. And if you're wondering about these fabric pieces that I'm using, my mom actually found them at a thrift store, and so I'm giving them a second life. They were cut out to be used something else. I think perhaps they were meant to be like a quilted tree skirt that never got finished. So yeah, I'm able to give these scraps, if you want to call them that, a second chance. And once your piece is cut out, you place it over the top of one of those picture window sections. You can get your tucking tool and start to tuck the edges of the fabric into the cut grooves. I recommend starting off by just tucking them in halfway into the grooves, and then you can still kind of adjust the fit as you need. And also, if you have an excess amount of fabric, you can trim that off as you need through the process. It's better to make your fabric pieces too big than too small, because if your fabric pieces are too small to begin with, then there's not enough fabric on the edges to stay anchored into the grooves, and it will just keep pulling out as you continue to make the ball, and it's really annoying. So it's better to cut these pieces too large and then trim them down, as opposed to cutting them too small, and then it just doesn't work. And if this is the first time you're making this kind of design, then I would recommend having some extra fabric on hand just in case you cut things too small and need to redo a piece. Some people like to put quilt batting behind the picture windows to make the fabric pop out from the surface of the ball. It can add a nice 3D effect, but for this ball, I've decided not to use batting. If you decide to use batting, you can use the cutting pattern to cut out the batting into the correct shape before gluing it into place. You can see how to use batting under the fabric pieces in my beginner's tutorial, which I will link in the description. Since you've already seen me do one of the windows in real time, I'm going to speed up the video here, and I think you get the idea. I'm doing the exact same thing that I did on the first picture window. Here, I just want to show you that if your fabric has an actual center, like the picture itself on the fabric has a center, and you need to actually keep it centered, you can just use a pin to keep it in place as you're tucking it. And then at the end of the tucking process, you can just pull the pin. All right, so I'm jumping ahead here, and I've gone ahead and finished all of the picture windows on my ornament, and next I'm going to fill in the top and the bottom with fabric. For these sections, there's no need to make a cutting template as my fabric pieces are already a manageable size and shape. I'm going to tuck the fabric over the sections in pretty much the same way that I did the window sections. Now, for this, I am not going to cut the fabric here on this crease. I'm in the seam, excuse me. I'm going to just leave the seam and then tuck the fabric in on the other side because I want this whole section to be the same fabric. And you might be wondering why I'm leaving that seam there, and that's because I need to actually see where that line is in a later step. I'm going to be putting some ribbon over the top, and it's going to help me keep everything lined up perfectly, so I can see that seam that is the line that I need to follow. You could cut the fabric there if you wanted to and tuck it into that seam. But for me, I'm just saving myself a step and tucking in the seam, but not cutting the fabric. So I've decided for this ornament, I want it to be super patchworky. I want it to look a lot like a quilt and everything sort of be mismatched and different. So I've chosen a different fabric from my stash here, and I'm going to basically be doing the same thing that you just saw me do with the green fabric. I'm doing here with this red fabric, and I'm going to cover each of the 4 top sections with 4 different kinds of fabric, 4 different colors, 4 different patterns of fabric. And then I'm going to repeat that on the south half of the ball, but instead of lining it up exactly, I'm going to kind of shift the colors so that things don't quite match up and don't touch. And so things will be similar but not matchy-matchy. All right, so now that I've finished up covering the ball in fabric, I'm going to grab some trims. I've got some rickrack and I've got some ribbon and some other kinds of trims. I've had these for a really long time in my stash and I think they'll look great on this ornament. I'm going to use this gold rickrack to cover the seams around the picture windows. And I'm having a little bit of trouble with this pin here. So I'm going to use my pin pusher tool. This is actually something I bought from a lace maker. It's just great for pushing in pins. It really saves my fingers. I used to use a thimble, but this tool is fantastic, and I will put a link to where I bought it in the description. I'm using these gold pins I've had for a while. They're a little tarnished, but they still do the job. And I'm just going to pin this rickrack at the corners and over the seams so that it's kind of framing these picture windows. I'm pinning it in a zigzag motion, sort of up and down over the seams in order to use one continuous piece and not have to cut it. You can use as many or as few pins as you see fit. Once this is made, it's going to be hanging on my tree and it's not really going to be handled much. So I'm not really worried about the ribbon slipping too much. So I'm trying to use as few pins as possible, but if you feel more comfortable using some more pins, then go right ahead. There's no right way here. You could also use a little bit of glue if you want to. Really, whatever works for you. If you do decide to use glue, I recommend that you find glue that dries very quickly and dries completely clear. And of course, when your rickrack or ribbon or whatever you've decided to use finally meets up Then you'll cut it and pin it in place. And I didn't mention this before, but the reason why I started at one of these center points here is because this is actually going to get covered up with ribbon in the next step. So I started it at that point so you won't be able to see where that cut is. Now we're not quite done with the rickrack yet. We've still got to cover up some seams at the North Pole and the South Pole. When you're reinforcing this ribbon across the North Pole, don't put the pins directly in the North Pole because you're going to put your hanging ribbon there and we're going to put a big giant pin in the middle there. So make sure that your reinforcing pins are kind of off to the side of the pole itself. And you don't have to worry about the place where the cuts are because we're going to cover that up with some sequins and some embellishments. So that is going to be covered up, the place where you cut the ribbon and it's joining the ribbon at the corners of the window. And you'll cover up those seams on both the north side of the ball and the south side of the ball. Now I'm going to take this ribbon and place it over the top of those seams that I left in the fabric. This is what I was talking about previously when I said I needed to see the line. Well, here is why I needed to see the line, is because I'm using the line as a guide for where to pin the ribbon. And now I'm going to repeat the process on the perpendicular seam. Okay, so now that I have the ribbon in place, I'm going to place this rickrack trim over the top of the ribbon. I've had this trim for a really long time, just waiting for the perfect project to use it with. I'm going to use these U-shaped pins to hold this trim down. I could use regular pins here, but I'm going to use these U-shaped pins because they're really going to hold it down much more securely. You may also notice that the end of this trim has a piece of tape around it. It's because this trim will unravel, so the tape is used to hold it together. So each time I cut this trim, I'm going to tape the end of it so it doesn't unravel. I'll also pin it at the South Pole. And I'm not pinning it directly to the South Pole. I'm pinning it kind of off to the side because I will be putting a long pin in the bottom of the South Pole, right on the pole. So I don't want anything that will prevent me from doing that. So keep your pins kind of off to the sides of the pole. And of course, I'll cover both lines of ribbon with the trim. Now I'm going to start embellishing my ornament. I'm going to start placing some beads and some sequins strategically around the ball in various spots. The first place I'm going to place some beads, I'm using a pearl-headed pin, and I have some red metallic beads. And I'm placing it right at the corner, the top corner, where I had, I told you before we were going to cover up where the two lines of rickrack ribbon meet. Well, here we are, covering that up with these beads. And it secures the ribbon, but it also covers up the place where the cut ribbon meets. And I'll do that on all of the top corner and the bottom corner of each of those windows. So I'm kind of making the window frame very pretty and ornate. Now you may notice that I'm not gluing anything down at this point. And that's because I'm sort of making this up as I go along. And I wasn't sure if what I was doing was going to work. And so I wanted to give myself the option of pulling it out and starting over. So I didn't glue anything down. But if you have devised a plan or you know what you're going to do and you know you're not going to pull it out and change it, then you can actually dip the ends of these pins in some all-purpose craft glue or some like Elmer school glue before you pin them to the ball. And that will help keep the pins in place over time. If you handle your ball a lot, then eventually the pins will loosen up and fall out, and that glue will just help them stay in place. Now, I know for sure that this probably isn't going to be handled very much. It'll hang on my Christmas tree and then it'll go in a box and I won't be, handling it very often. And when I do handle it, I'll be gentle. I know how to take care of these. So the fact that I'm not gluing it isn't going to make that big of a difference. But if you're, say, for example, going to sell this ornament, I highly recommend that you glue those pins. Okay, so as I was talking, you saw me pin 2 of these teardrop shaped, elongated kind of pearl head pins next to those red metallic beads. And now I'm going to pin with the other pearl head pin some large sequins below the metallic bead. And of course, I'm doing it on all the corners. I'm basically keeping to the same pattern for each of the windows. And I encourage you to experiment with your embellishments and find out what works for you and what you think looks the most beautiful. This is where you can let your creativity really shine. Now I'm going to work on the South Pole. I'm going to use one of these extra long pearl head pins and use a metallic red bead and a pearl bead. And I'm going to pin that, and also a sequin. And I'm going to pin that directly to the South Pole. And sometimes it can be a little difficult to get these really straight, but I'm going to try to get it as straight as possible so it's pointing directly down. Now in the 4 corners where all those ribbons meet, I'm going to pin a metallic red bead on a pearl head pin. And this is going to create what I call a crown effect. But of course, this crown will be hanging upside down. So maybe more like an icicle effect. And now I'm going to make a bow and a hanging ribbon for the top of my ornament. And I'm not going to go into great detail about how I make this. I have another video that will teach you in detail how I make my bows. So if you're really interested in learning how I make my bows, then please go to that video. The link is in the description. And please watch that video because it goes into great detail. But here I'm just gonna breeze right through it. All right, so once my hanging ribbon and bow are finished, I will pin that to the top of the ball right at the North Pole. And I'm also going to reinforce this with some extra pins, because with just one pin and that hanging ribbon, it may loosen up over time and it may fall out. So using a couple of extra pearl head pins to just reinforce everything, pin it down a couple of more times, and it'll just take some pressure off of that single top pin. So there is my finished ornament. And as you can see, the ribbon that I used for the bow was wired ribbon, so it's like really holding that stiff shape. It looks really nice. I really like using wired ribbon for these bows. And yeah, so if you enjoyed watching this video, if you like this tutorial and this ornament, please give me a thumbs up and make sure that you like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.